Welcome to the Tech Trek, where technology leaders share their insights, experiences, and views. Every week I bring you a new guest. And on today's episode...
My name is Allan Cutler. I am a director of engineering at Endpoint. And Endpoint is a digital title and settlement company. And our mission is to focus on the real estate transaction and the closing experience and making that as transparent and as easy for everybody as possible.
Awesome, Al. I'm excited to have you on the show. I know we're going to be talking about data-driven leadership. Before we dive in, let's make sure everyone knows what we mean about that. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I want to make sure we have the same semantics going forward. But what does data-driven leadership mean to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Having data is not really enough at the end of the day, right? It's behavior, it's a mindset, right? How do we use data to make business decisions? How do we use data to, work with cross-functional stakeholders and justify why we're doing certain things within engineering? And sometimes as engineering leaders, it's hard to justify to non-technical stakeholders, why should we invest in it? If we're going to spend X number of dollars on, general budget or going in buying third-party software, paying off tech debt, doing things like that. Why is it important? And a lot of the times it's subjective. It's like, hey, trust us. We just need to do these things. So having data that allows you to feel confident in your decision making and how that ties back to the business is really important.
Awesome. Obviously, you mentioned, helping explain why people should listen to whatever it is that the data is trying to prove. I guess when it comes to helping get buy-in, right, and using data, obviously you always hear about data and you can kind of spin it for whatever you need. How do you help prevent that, right? I mean, I want buy-in, but obviously, I got to be very careful not to bias the data to be favorable to what I want.
There's several ways you could do it, right? One way that I've done it a couple times is I like to, if I'm at an organization, is really build an OpEx or an operational excellence program for engineering. So how do we take the data, and again, not providing bias to your point, but how do we just take the data as data in multiple different areas across the software delivery lifecycle, and just having the data speak for itself in certain key areas. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. There's different, engineering maturity models where you can look at different ways of measuring the effectiveness of your organization. How do you get data to be able to then grade how effective you are or ineffective you are in certain key areas? But how do you really build kind of a single pane of glass within this OpEx program around, again, the SDLC? I can dig into some of those metrics, but building that's transparent to stakeholders and everybody in the organization, and explaining how you're getting those metrics. And the important thing with the data is that you feel there's integrity in the data, right? You feel confident that data is accurate and telling the appropriate story.
Absolutely. And what are some of those? I know everyone has their own metrics they like to measure, keep track of, and some are universal, some are particular to preferences. What are you interested in tracking when it comes to your team?
So you mentioned a few that may be pretty standard or ones that are more particular. Ones that I think just are good baseline metrics to establish are DevOps or DORA metrics. Right, those four are really great because it tells you a lot of things within those four. If you're looking at lead time, right, what's the time from ideation to actually delivering on that idea? How frequently are you releasing? And that metric, it changes, right, depending on the needs of the business. Does the business need to release software every day? Does it need to deliver software on a train? There's mean time to change failure rates, right? So how often is a release going to fail? There's a lot you can do within your CI/CD pipelines and prioritization and processes to help with that. Different metrics around quality, gates that you can implement. So DORA is just a really good kind of initial set. Going past that, there's a lot that you can do around observability metrics also to try to just build around quality. So when you're thinking about SLOs and SLIs, which are service level objectives, service level indicators, there's several that you can start looking at around the actual performance of your system. that you can include as well. So things like latency time, or on the front end, longest time to paint, different performance metrics that you can include, quality metrics around unit testing, which is talked a lot about, integration testing, but bug fixes, the priority of bugs, how often bugs are occurring. You can build all that into a narrative, right? And a lot of those are pretty standard metrics that a lot of engineers and a lot of engineering leaders know about. But it's really how you tell the story of that data that's really important, right? So if you can build kind of a cohesive narrative around that data that tells a story, and it's not this fractured experience, it's going to make it a lot easier to be able to evangelize and talk about why you're doing certain things that you're doing. And there's a lot of different ways you can go about that, which we could talk about, different platforms or different techniques. But Dora is one set, which is really good. Observability, performance metrics, quality metrics, but going into ones that are a little bit more particular, sometimes it really depends on business, right? What are you trying to solve as a business? Ones that I also want to look at is just how effective are we as an organization, and what is our velocity? And so you can use Jira, right, for that, or you can pull that up into an OpEx program and pull that from Jira into Power Story. But you want to understand where there's bottlenecks in that process, right? So through the SDLC, there's many different ways you can do it. But for me, a data-driven leadership is coming back and justifying what data that we're tracking to be able to solve business problems using technology, right? So it's not going to be a surprise around a lot of these metrics. It's just how do you effectively evangelize that data? And that sometimes is a bigger struggle than actually measuring the data.
Yeah, I imagine. Obviously, you're trying to get buy-in. A lot of conversations will come around prioritization of different initiatives, and how do you have people be able to tell their trade-offs for their project versus what they see somebody else getting, or whatever that might be. I guess prioritization, I mean, you're going to hopefully use that data to help make those cases of, when stakeholders are looking at what the team's delivering and picking to work on, some of that's being funneled in through the data that you've been collecting.
It does. And in my experience, I look at a roadmap. You just have to have a roadmap that is engineering and product. You can't have an engineering roadmap or a product roadmap, because you're going to have competing, interests of what you want to do for a given quarter, as an example, right? So what I've seen so far, the most effective way of doing it is you have a single roadmap, and you go through and you have to work with your peers, product design executives, and so forth, and build out what makes sense for what you need to work on. But if you have that data, it's easier to go. Just like product may have analytics where they say, okay, we built user funnels, and this is what we need to improve in the process from a user experience. Engineering has to have the same ability to be a little bit more objective and less subjective, right? So if you have a single roadmap and you can go through and build that story, it's easier to prioritize initiatives that are cross-cutting initiatives from an engineering perspective, because you have something to back up your story, which is so critical. And you can bring that to the conversation, especially if you have a very data-driven organization holistically, where product is looking at data metrics for users. You have design that's doing design and research and trying to understand different findings earlier from an R&D perspective. It kind of forces engineering to do different things so that it's not too product focused, or it's not too engineering focused on the other end, right? It's it's an art at the end of the day.
You mentioned center of excellence and helping capture the right data and establish the right behaviors, the right actions. I guess maybe tell us a little bit about the center of excellence and kind of what you've done, so it ties back into some of the the data that you're looking to capture, and kind of how does that actually help the process?
Yeah, so I've done it a couple ways at different organizations. I think one platform that does it really well, I'll use an example, would be, for instance, Datadog. Datadog allows you to build custom dashboards, right? And you can use Datadog for, obviously, performance is and observability, which is what a lot of people use it for. But you can push in data and build these custom dashboards that are completely transparent to any stakeholder. So you can push in, for instance, performance metrics. right? You can push in obviously your observability metrics. You can push in, if you're using a platform like LaunchDarkly, you can push in, feature flag metrics. How often are features getting released, or do we need to roll back on features? You can build this narrative within that dashboard. Same thing with Jira, right? You can push different Jira metrics or integrate different Jira dashboards and widgets into the platform. Another way I've done it is with like Google Data Studio, right? Where you can use Google Data Studio and all the connectors to kind of build these narratives and push data, different API integrations into Google. And then that makes it available, just like when you're building any insights from a BI perspective, right? You want to make data available for the business to make decisions. And so you're just kind of bringing that down one level to engineering. And you're saying, well, what's the BI version of that for engineering? And then how do I provide that to the business at the end of the day?
Absolutely. I guess, you early on mentioned something about quality. Obviously, the conversation of velocity, quality, and the data points you're capturing, play with each other because you're managing to both of those. And when I think about quality and velocity, the concept that discussion of tech debt pops up because obviously, you can only do so much in so much time and make sure that you're ensuring X quality. How do you track that tech debt component in terms of the data driven decisions? Because obviously ties back into stakeholders, ties back into the non-technical people as well.
When you think about tech debt and the quality component, it really starts at the beginning. I'm a big believer in quality engineering, not so much QA anymore, right? So when you think about DevOps, it's really as a culture, right? How you think about how you develop software. So when you're looking at quality and different parts of the system, you can track data, right? You can track, given tickets that apply to different services. If you're in a microservice architecture, you can label those given bugs and you can figure out where certain areas of the system are performing better than other areas. Holistically, not just in the data, you can look at the overall architecture and the patterns, and are we moving towards the proper architecture principles as an organization that we want to move towards? You can try to tie in some data there, around the architecture and holistic system design. But the problems, depending on the architecture and where you're focusing, the problems are slightly different, organization to organization. But I would look at it again from a narrative perspective of, where can we see performance issues in the system? How do we label that? Quality? How can we label bugs from a user impact perspective? Can we work with if you have a CX team or a customer experience team, getting insights from a customer perspective of where they're seeing issues in the system? You can start focusing and building kind of data narratives around those key areas. You just have to understand, from working with business stakeholders, depending on the business, CX or working with design and research, is building those narratives that make sense for the organization. But it does take time, right? And it takes investment. And that's one thing you have to do is, as an engineering leader, is you have to have the company understand that and buy into this philosophy of being data-driven from behavior perspective and actually prioritizing the actual work required to be data-driven, which sometimes may feel like we're slowing down to speed up. But if you can get that buy-in from the organization that, let us take some time to really think about how we want to measure success, then in the long run, you always see those dividends. And a big piece of it is, if your organization is using a goal-driven framework like OKRs or OGSMs or whatever they're using, if you have data and you're building engineering goals, you can actually build measurable engineering goals, and you can feel confident that you're focusing on the outcomes of the data versus the output of your teams. Even if you're monitoring that, that's great, but you can actually show to the business that we're using data to actually have measurable outcomes.
I think that's really interesting. I guess when you're going into the concept of data-driven leadership, I think everything you just said fits very well, especially sitting down with a non-technical stakeholder. They should be able to understand some of those implications of the decisions the engineering team is making.
They should, right? And when you're dealing with non-technical stakeholders, you're not really going to get in the weeds of how you're going to implement something, right? You're not going to talk about, hey, we're going to implement a REST interface or a GraphQL interface, because it's just not valuable to them at the end of the day, right? The universal language that we can speak is data, because a CEO of an organization, or another C-level executive, ideally they're going to be looking at data to make high-level business decisions and important decisions for the organization, right? So if you can provide engineering metrics that are speaking that same language, again, from a business insights perspective, right? Where you're providing data to say, listen, you don't need to know the underlying technical implementation, but you do need to understand the data and why we're making the choices that we're making. That's always an easier conversation for them to say, I don't really need to know the technical details because you've done the work to provide me with an understanding of why those decisions are being made. Because typically when you provide those technical details, they just get lost, frankly, right? And it's hard as an engineering leader to get buy-in and the investment that's required to actually not just build something, but something that scales, and something, again, to the point of quality, something that actually will meet the business need or be able to project out growth of the business and provide confidence to business stakeholders that you want to grow 3x over the next set of years. Well, we've done the right performance testing. We have the right data to prove to you that we can actually support that business growth.
I like that. I guess the one thing to kind of tie in the data-driven leadership and maybe your team, the managers that you report to you, obviously it's something that they're following, so it rolls up to you. You can report it further up. I guess when you're working with your direct reports, what are you working with them in terms of metrics that they need to provide? How frequently do you look for those metrics? Give us some insights in terms of the relationship with your reports when it comes to data-driven leadership.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So, if you provide kind of high-level metrics that you want to track, I'm a big believer in, from a data and from a work perspective, that there is always a nature of top-down, but then you have to provide the bottoms-up, right? And so, how do my managers or my teams? How can they provide their insight and their voice into that narrative as well, which is really important. So there are certain metrics that they can bring to the table and say, hey, we're going to track this because it bubbles up to a broader business outcome, or it bubbles up to supporting metrics. They may be leading or lagging indicators, but at the end of the day, we're pushing in the same direction from a data perspective. Now, making that transparent and more of a self-service type of approach where you can make business decisions based on more of a data self-service is really important. But looking at that from a cadence perspective is maybe different for a team. But if we look at it from like a quarterly planning perspective, if it's lagging, you're going to know at the end of the quarter, right? If it's leading, we may know obviously as things are happening. But if you can identify how you're going to actually track and grade those metrics, then you can figure out a cadence for those as you work with your managers. And again, which metrics matter? How do they bubble up to the broader outcomes or the supporting metrics? And what are the impact metrics that we're actually caring about? Because businesses will have their own impact metrics from a revenue perspective or from a growth point of view. So there's additional metrics from a bottoms up perspective that you can track, as long as you can just tie that back to why you're actually tracking those metrics. What's the justification for it? How does that support other metrics at a higher level that we may be tracking as well?
I think it's a fantastic subject, and I like your point of view, and I think the way you work with your team seems like they're going to be fully understanding of what's expected of them, and that obviously rolls into you. I like to ask guests a few questions before I let them go to have the audience get to know you a little bit more. So I thought I'd throw a couple of those at you before we wrap it up. For you, I guess you've moved into management, different responsibilities. I'm assuming you got into technology because you enjoyed it, and as you move further away, you're less hands-on. How do you stay connected to technology? Obviously, in a different way than being hands-on, but how do you stay connected to it?
It can be difficult, right? I'm a big believer as a leader. I want to be as relatable as possible. And I look at leadership and management as two very different things, right? I think anybody can be a leader, and being a manager, you're focusing on the people side, right? But I want to be as relatable to the team as possible. So I want to take that extra time to stay technical. Now, I have a wife and two daughters, and so everybody has things outside of work. But I do look at technology really at the end of the day as a hobby, and I don't feel like I had to make a career decision. I've loved tech since I was young, and so for me it's fun and it's exciting on the weekend before my kids get up to read an article, or after work. I'll code out a few things. I might see a new library, and I'll jump in for an hour and get in an IDE and get the code down. And I don't look at that as my main output anymore, right? From a 9 to 5 perspective, or for an organization. But I do want to stay as relatable as possible. And if there are problems that my team is trying to solve, I may, from my own knowledge, go and actually jump into a given subject so that I know it better, so that I can support the team. And I look at it from more of a servant leadership perspective. My job is to be there to unblock the team, make sure the team has what they need, and hire people that are smarter than I am. But I do want to still stay relevant to make sure that the team can have those conversations and feel comfortable, and making sure that I have their back.
Absolutely. I guess you mentioned, coding on your own, reading an article. I was going to ask you, how do you enable that continuing education? Is it just a mix of, reading, hands-on? Do you take courses? Do you, how do you kind of go about making sure that you're staying up to par and all the upcoming and evolving components of technology?
Well, I think we're spoiled today, and I feel spoiled because when I started, I went to Barnes and Noble and would sit and read tech books. We didn't have YouTube and all the different education platforms that we have now. So I definitely feel like we have all the information we need at the palm of our hands. And I had an interesting way into technology. A lot of it was really self-taught. And so I spent a lot of time reading books before you actually had other methods and other mediums. But so now I still love to read tech books. I have a Pluralsight membership. I love going on Pluralsight. I'm a big fan of them. O'Reilly I've had as well, to do audibles, or to do just reading on my iPad. I'll go on YouTube every once in a while and look at tutorials of things that I might be interested in. But I try to do a mix of everything. That I'm just one of those people. I'm just a consumer of information, and I want to be a sponge. And so depending on what the subject is, I might listen to something, or, if it's a system design, I'll probably go on and watch something, a visual representation of it, so that I can see, what these concepts would be. But I'm somebody that I have ADHD. And so I believe it's a superpower in a lot of ways. But the biggest struggle for me is just making sure that I'm always staying very centered. And for me, learning has always been kind of a unique experience. And so I like to try different flavors of everything, and and see what makes the most sense on a given topic.
Absolutely. If the current Allan could jump back and talk to the Allan that was about to just move into his first managerial role, what piece of advice would you like to have passed on?
Wow, there's a lot. Don't be too hard or too critical of yourself. Being a new manager, I always felt like I needed to know everything that was going on, because and a lot of managers could relate to this, right? As you go from an IC to a manager, your output day to day looks very different, right? You're not coding and feeling really good about something tactical that you did for the day. So you have to kind of lead that mindset. So being less critical, trusting by default is a big one that I believe in. Knowing how to navigate different conversations and people. And I was always very outgoing, but I didn't really necessarily know how to kind of manage a collective. And I jumped into management kind of typical, how a lot of engineering managers jump in, which is you didn't have formal training, but you got the job, right? And you're like, well, now I'm gonna figure out how to make this work. And it took a little while, but I started getting the hang of it and started feeling really comfortable. And I realized it was something that I really loved to do because I love working with people. I love talking with people. I really focus on people, process, and product or technology. So I think about people first and want to get to know them and be relatable to them and understand who they are. So being less critical of myself and being more business driven, right? When you become a manager, you're solving business problems by using technology. And so the technology decisions you make are important, but as an IC, you look at those as this is a really cool piece of tech. I want to build it because I'm hands-on, versus that might not always be the best business decision at the end of the day because it's not going to help the organization get where it needs to be.
Absolutely. I love that. Allan, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I think great insights, and I appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Amir. It was great.
That's it for this episode. I'll be back again with a different guest, a different topic. Until then, please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment wherever you are watching or listening to this episode. I can't thank you enough if you do. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.